The smell of sawdust never really leaves a man who spent 40 years building things with his hands. Even now, retired, my garage still holds that particular scent, cedar and motor oil, and something older, something that smells like patience. I was standing at my workbench on a Thursday evening, sanding the corner of a small oak side table I'd been making for no particular reason, just to keep my hands busy, when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. My son-in-law. I set down the sandpaper and answered. Richard. His voice carried that particular tone he always used with me, not rude enough to confront, not warm enough to ignore. Somewhere in the middle, where a man like Marcus lived most of his life. I'm calling about Sunday. Sunday was the housewarming party. The party for the house I had quietly, without any ceremony, contributed $187,000 toward building. My daughter Claire and Marcus had been in it for 3 weeks. 4 bedrooms, a chef's kitchen, a back deck with cedar railings I'd helped select. I knew every corner of that house. What about Sunday? I asked. There was a pause. Not a nervous one, a calculating one. We've been thinking about the guest list, he said. Claire and I, we want the gathering to reflect a certain kind of energy. The people in our circle now, colleagues, her new friends from the firm, some of my clients. It's a professional crowd, Richard. People at a particular stage of life. Another pause. We think it would flow better if it was just that group. I kept my hand on the oak table. The wood was smooth under my palm. You're asking me not to come to my daughter's housewarming, I said. We're asking you to understand the vision for the event, he said. You'd be more comfortable at a different kind of gathering. This is cocktails and catering, not you know. It's just not really your scene. Not my scene. I had poured concrete footings in January, cold 31 years ago, to build the company that made me the money that built the house he was standing in. I had eaten lunches out of a metal box on construction sites from Alabama to Montana. I had buried my wife of 34 years, 8 months after her diagnosis, and kept working because stopping would have meant lying down and never getting back up. And Marcus Hale, 38 years old, who had never once in 5 years looked me in the eye when he shook my hand, was telling me the housewarming party for a house I paid for was not my scene. I didn't say any of that. I understand, I said. Good. Claire will. Good night, Marcus. I hung up. I stood at the workbench for a long time after that. The garage was quiet. Outside, the Alabama evening was doing what Alabama evenings do in October, cooling slowly, the crickets starting up, the last of the light going amber through the high window above the shelving. I picked up the sandpaper again, set it down again. Then I walked inside, poured 2 fingers of bourbon I didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table where my wife used to do the crossword every Sunday morning. Her chair was still angled the way she always left it, slightly pulled out, as if she'd just stepped away. I thought about Claire. My daughter, who had her mother's eyes, and her grandmother's stubbornness, and who I had coached through Little League, and driven to 17 college visits, and walked down an aisle 3 years ago, with a heart so full I could barely breathe. Claire, who had not called me herself tonight, who had let her husband make this particular call. That told me something. I didn't sleep much. I sat in that kitchen for a long while, and then I went to bed, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, I made a decision, the same way I've made most of my decisions, quietly, completely, without drama. By 6 a.m. Friday, I was on the phone. The first call was to my attorney, Paul Greer. Paul and I went to high school together in Decatur. He's been my personal attorney for 22 years, and he answers his cell before 7 because he's always been that kind of man. Paul, I said, I need you to look at the terms of that transfer we structured last spring. The contribution to Claire's property account. The 187? Yes. Specifically, I need to know what our options are regarding the conditional nature of that gift, whether the conditions were ever formally documented. There was a brief silence. Paul knew me well enough not to ask unnecessary questions. Give me an hour. The second call was to my daughter's contractor, a man named Gary Whitfield, who runs Whitfield Custom Homes out of Huntsville. Gary had built the house. I had introduced Marcus and Claire to Gary. I had vouched for Gary with the lender, and Gary had done me a favor on the timeline because of that relationship. Gary, it's Richard Calloway. Richard, Sunday's the big day, huh? You must be excited. About that, I said. I need to ask you something directly. When you completed the final walkthrough last month, was there a punch list still outstanding? Items that were promised, but not yet resolved? Gary hesitated. Well, there are always a few things on a list like that. The pantry shelving wasn't completed to spec. The master bath exhaust fan is still running louder than it should, and we never finished the trim detail on the back bedroom window. Marcus said he'd circle back on those items after the party. So there are outstanding contractual obligations. Another hesitation. Gary was a smart man. Richard, what's going on? I'm going to need you to hold off on marking that project closed, Gary. Don't process the final documentation as complete. There are items outstanding, and I want them on record. Richard, I'm not asking you to do anything improper. I'm asking you to be accurate. Are those items resolved or not? They are not, he said. Thank you, Gary. The third call was to a man named Donald Ferris at Cornerstone Bank in Birmingham. Donald handled commercial accounts. He also, as it happened, sat on the board of the neighborhood association that governed the subdivision where Marcus had recently been angling for a seat on the Architectural Review Committee, a position that would have given Marcus considerable social currency in the community he was so eager to impress. I didn't ask Donald to do anything improper either. I simply reminded him of a conversation we'd had at the chamber dinner in September, during which Marcus had rather enthusiastically described a real estate side project he was pursuing, one that, as I understood it, sat in an interesting gray area relative to his employment agreement at his firm. I just thought that was worth a follow-up conversation, I told Donald. Probably nothing. But you know how I feel about due diligence. I appreciate you flagging it, Donald said. By 9:30 Friday morning, I had made 7 calls. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. I did not make those calls out of anger. Anger is a fire, and fires are wasteful. They burn everything, including things you want to keep. What I felt sitting in my kitchen that morning was not anger. It was a kind of clarity. The same clarity I felt decades ago when a business partner tried to cut me out of a contract I'd spent 2 years building. I didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't make a scene. I simply made sure that every door he needed to walk through in this state required a key that I held. I have never needed to raise my voice. I have never needed to. At 11 o'clock Friday morning, my phone rang. It was Claire. Dad. Her voice was strange, thin, like she was choosing each word very carefully. Marcus told me he called you last night. He did. Dad, I want to explain. You don't have to explain anything, sweetheart. I didn't know he was going to call you like that. I didn't know exactly what he was going to say. I noticed she didn't say she disagreed with the outcome. She didn't say she wanted me there. Claire, I said gently, how are you? A silence. Then, I'm fine. I want you to know this isn't about you. The party is just a certain kind of energy. I know, Marcus explained it. Dad, I love you, I said. I'll talk to you soon. I set the phone down. I went back to the garage and I finished sanding that oak table. The work was quiet and the grain was good, and by the time I was done, it was late afternoon and the amber light was back in the high window. And I felt, if not at peace, then at least like myself. Saturday, I drove 2 hours to visit my old friend Walter Briggs in Tuscaloosa. Walter and I built houses together for 15 years before he retired. We ate brisket at a place he liked on the river and talked about football and his grandchildren and a fishing trip we'd been planning for 3 years and never taken. I didn't mention Marcus, or Claire, or the housewarming. I didn't need to. Walter had known me long enough to understand that when I drove 2 hours to sit with him, I was processing something, and that the processing didn't require his input. That's the thing about getting older that nobody tells you when you're young. You develop a tolerance for your own discomfort. You learn that some pain is not an emergency. You learn that silence is not the same as absence, that patience is not the same as weakness. I got home Saturday night and found an email from Paul Greer. The conditional gift documentation. From last spring, we had been careful, Paul and I, in how we structured that transfer. It had been recorded as a family loan with deferred repayment terms, not an outright gift. which was partly a tax decision, and partly, I will be honest, because Paul had once told me, when I was describing the situation with Marcus, that a man should always maintain a posture of options. I had listened to Paul. The loan terms, Paul now confirmed in his email, were structured with a material change clause. Should the primary relationship change in a way that affected the purpose for which the funds were provided, namely, the establishment of a family home for my daughter, the repayment schedule could be accelerated at the lender's discretion. I was the lender. I wrote back to Paul, "Let's schedule a call Monday morning." Sunday came. I woke at my usual time, made coffee, read the paper on the porch. The Alabama morning was cool and clean, the kind of fall morning that makes you glad to be alive and in a place that has seasons. I had no plans. That was fine. I was 68 years old and I had learned to be comfortable in my own days. At 12:47 p.m., while I was eating lunch, my phone rang. It was a number I recognized but hadn't expected. Janet Hale, Marcus's mother, calling from her home in Mountain Brook. "Richard." She sounded the way people sound when they are trying to be composed but aren't quite. "I think we need to talk." Janet Hale was not a woman I disliked. She was socially calculating in the way that certain Mountain Brook women of her generation are socially calculating. It was less malice than conditioning. She had never been particularly warm to me, but she had never been outright unkind either. I had always placed her in the category of people who behave well when it costs them nothing, and poorly when it does. "Of course, Janet. What's on your mind?" "Marcus called me this morning. He seems to be under the impression that there are some financial complications related to the house. Something with the contractor and the bank." She paused. "I told him I thought he might be overreacting, but he seems quite upset." "I see. Richard, I want to speak plainly." "Please do." "Whatever Marcus said to you, and I'm not defending it, because I've spoken to Claire this morning, and I understand more than he realizes. I do whatever he said. I don't think it's worth destroying what my son and your daughter have built." "Neither do I," I said. "Then why?" "Janet," I said, "I want to ask you something. If your husband, 30 years ago, he had called your father the night before a family celebration and told him he wasn't welcome because he didn't fit a certain social profile, what do you think your father would have done?" A very long silence. "My father," she said finally, "would have made sure my husband understood the weight of that decision for the rest of his natural life." "Then I think you understand exactly where I am," I said. Another silence. Then, quietly, "Yes, I suppose I do. Thank you for calling, Janet." At 2:15, Marcus called. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message. His voice was different from Thursday night. The calculation was gone, replaced by something more exposed. He said there had been some misunderstandings. He said he hoped we could talk. He said, and here his voice shifted into a register I had never heard from him before, something almost young, that he realized his call Thursday night had not been appropriate and that he wanted to discuss it. I listened to the message twice. I did not call back. At 4 o'clock, a car pulled into my driveway. I was in the garden, cutting back the Confederate jasmine along the back fence. My late wife, Margaret, had planted that jasmine the year Claire was born, and I keep it now because it is hers, because the scent of it in April is as close as I can get to sitting in the same room as her. The car doors opened. It was Claire. She was alone. She walked across the yard toward me, and I could see from 30 feet away that she had been crying. Not recently, the particular exhaustion around her eyes was hours old. She was still dressed from the party, a navy dress I'd seen her wear before, her hair pulled back. She looked like her mother at 34, and she looked like a woman who had made some discoveries about her own life in the last several hours. I set down the pruning shears and waited. She stopped a few feet from me. She looked at the jasmine. She looked at me. "The party ended early," she said. "I'm sorry to hear that. The caterer called at noon. Said there was a billing issue. The wine delivery didn't come, same thing. Account discrepancy. 2 of Marcus's biggest clients canceled this morning. He thinks it's related to something at his firm. Some compliance question that came up." She paused. "The contractor sent a formal notice that the house isn't documented as completed, which means the homeowner's insurance has questions." She paused again. "We had 30 people standing in the living room by 2 o'clock, and Marcus was on the phone the whole time, and I stood there. Her voice broke slightly on the last word, then held. I stood there in my own house, and I realized I didn't know half the people he'd invited. I realized I hadn't invited a single person I actually loved. I didn't say anything. The jasmine moved slightly in the October wind. You weren't there, she said. My father wasn't at my housewarming. She looked at me, and her mother's eyes were very clear and very direct. That was wrong, Dad. That was wrong, and I should have stopped it, and I didn't, and I'm sorry. You don't owe me an apology. I absolutely do. She said it with a firmness that sounded like the best parts of who she was. I let him make that call. I knew he was going to make it, and I told myself it was easier to let it happen and fix it later, and there is no later for Thursday night. There's no fixing it. It happened. I looked at my daughter for a moment, 34 years old, my whole life, in a navy dress, standing in the garden her mother planted. Did you have a conversation with Marcus today? I asked. I had several. A small, exhausted sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He's been on the phone all afternoon trying to understand what happened. He doesn't fully understand yet. She looked at me carefully. Do you want to tell me what happened? I made some calls, I said. I figured. She was quiet for a moment. Is it fixable? The financial things? The contractor situation? Most things are fixable, I said. That's one of the things I've learned in 68 years. The question is never really whether something can be fixed. The question is what a person does while they're figuring that out. Whether they get small or whether they get honest. Claire looked at the ground, then back up. He needs to call you. He needs to actually call you and mean it. He's already called me once today, I said. That wasn't enough. No, I agreed. It wasn't. She nodded slowly, like she was accepting the terms of something. I'm going to stay here tonight, if that's okay. I don't want to go back to the house right now. I want to sit somewhere that feels like us. I'll make dinner, I said. She helped me finish with the jasmine first. We worked side by side for 20 minutes without talking, which is a thing we have always been able to do, exist in the same space without filling it with noise. Margaret was like that too. It's a kind of inheritance I'm glad passed down. Inside, I made the chicken and rice that her mother used to make on Sunday evenings, the recipe from the index card box that still sits on the counter in Margaret's handwriting. Claire sat at the kitchen table in her mother's chair, not the angled one, the chair across from it that had always been hers since she was 7 years old, and she was quiet for a long time. I've been making excuses for him, she said finally. Not to me, really. To the room, to herself, not in a dramatic way. Just in the small, constant way where you notice something and then you explain it and then you move on and then you notice something again and explain it again, and you don't realize that adding it all up looks like a pattern until the night you're standing in your own house and your father isn't there. I didn't respond right away. I kept my attention on the chicken. When your mother was alive, I said. After a moment, she used to say that the way a man treats your family is a preview of how he'll treat you when things get hard. She said it about me, too. She was watching how I treated her mother from the very beginning, and she told me that years later. What did Grandma think of you? She thought I was too quiet and too stubborn and that I'd make a satisfactory husband. A small smile. High praise from Miriam. Claire laughed. The real kind. The one that lives in her chest, not the polite one she uses in professional settings. It filled the kitchen, and for a moment, the room sounded like it used to. What did you actually do, Dad? To the party, what actually happened? I brought the food to the table and sat down across from her, and I told her. Not all of it, not every call, not every detail, but enough. I told her about the call with Paul, about the loan documentation, about the conversation with Gary Whitfield regarding the punch list, about Donald Ferris and the neighborhood board, and the question that had been raised about Marcus's side project. She listened without interrupting. This is another thing she inherited, the ability to listen completely. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, the punch list is real. Those items were never finished. I know. The firm question, is that real too? I don't know, I said honestly. I know what Marcus told me about the project at Easter dinner when he'd had 2 glasses of wine and was feeling expansive. Whether it's actually a compliance issue is between Marcus and his firm. I simply made sure the right person was aware of the question. Claire absorbed that. That's a significant thing to do, Dad. Yes, I said. It is. Do you regret it? I thought about that genuinely, the way the question deserved. I thought about Thursday night in the garage, the phone call, the tone of Marcus's voice. I thought about my daughter standing in her own house at a party she hadn't chosen, surrounded by people she hadn't wanted, without the one person who had loved her since before she could walk. I regret that it was necessary, I said. I don't regret doing it. She nodded. He has to understand what he did, she said. Not just the money stuff, the actual thing. He will, I said. Or he won't. That part isn't mine to control. We ate dinner. The chicken was right. Margaret's recipe never fails. Claire had seconds, and we talked about other things, easier things about my nephew's new baby, about a fishing trip. Walter and I were finally going to plan for real, about the side table I was building in the garage, which Claire immediately claimed for her reading corner if she ever had a reading corner again. When the house gets sorted, she said, with a certain careful precision in the word when. When the house gets sorted, I agreed. After dinner, she went to call Marcus. I stayed in the kitchen and washed the dishes by hand the way I always do, which Margaret used to call my form of meditation. She wasn't wrong. There's something in the simple sequence of it. Hot water, soap, the weight of a plate, the rinse that clears a man's thinking. I could hear Claire's voice from the hallway. Not the words, just the tone. It was firm. It was tired. It was honest in a way that I recognized as her best self, the version of her that doesn't apologize for its edges. I finished the dishes and dried my hands and sat with the bourbon I'd poured Thursday night and still hadn't touched. I picked it up, set it back down. My phone buzzed. A text message from Marcus. It said, Richard, I owe you a conversation, a real one. I understand if you're not ready for that yet. I'm not going to pretend I fully understand everything that happened this weekend, but I understand enough to know I was wrong on Thursday night, and that's where it has to start. I'm sorry. I read it twice. It was not a perfect apology. It had the particular shape of a message written by a man who is still processing shock, along with remorse. The part about not fully understanding everything was transparent, and the phrasing about where it has to start had the slight quality of a man who is already thinking about the negotiation ahead. But it was real. It was more real than anything Marcus Hale had ever sent me. I put the phone down without responding, not because I intended to be cruel, because a message like that deserves more than a text message in return. It deserves a table and 2 chairs, and the kind of conversation where a man has to look another man in the face and find out what he's actually made of when the performance of confidence has nowhere to go. That conversation would happen, not tonight, but it would happen, and it would be honest, and at the end of it, Marcus would understand something he had not understood before, not just about me, not just about what I could do, but about what his wife needed from the man she married, and what that required of him, and why the kind of man who calls his father-in-law the night before a party to say he doesn't fit the scene is the kind of man who wakes up one day in a large, empty house, wondering where everything went. I have seen it happen. I have watched men my age, successful men, men with portfolios and firm names and the right zip codes, standing at the edges of their children's lives, like strangers at a window, holding gifts nobody asked for, showing up to events they weren't exactly invited to, just not quite explicitly excluded from either. Their children courteous and distant in the particular way that means love has been replaced by obligation. That is the cost. Not money. Money is the smallest part of what it costs. The cost is the kitchen table on a Sunday morning. The cost is the recipe on the index card in your wife's handwriting. The cost is your daughter pulling her chair back up to the table and having seconds and laughing the real laugh, the one that lives in her chest. No amount of money buys that back once it's gone, and no amount of social positioning makes up for its absence. I have built things my whole life. Houses, roads, a company, a family. I know what foundations are. I know the difference between a wall that looks solid and a wall that is solid. I know what happens years down the line When a man builds on the wrong material, when he puts a beautiful structure on ground that isn't settled, when he mistakes the appearance of a thing for its substance. The cracks come, they always come. The only question is how far the building has to fall before the man inside it decides to be honest about the ground beneath him. Sunday night, 10:47, I got up from the kitchen table and turned off the lights and walked down the hall and stopped for a moment outside the guest room where Claire was sleeping. The door was closed, the light was off. She was there, in this house, in a room that had always been hers, and that was enough for tonight. I went to bed. Outside, the Alabama night was doing what it does. The crickets, the cooling, the particular quiet of a place that has been home for a long time. I lay in the dark for a while and thought about nothing and everything, the way a man does at 68, when the days have been long and the decisions have been made and the outcomes are not yet fully settled. But the important ones, the ones that depend only on yourself, are already decided. I thought about my wife. I thought, Margaret, I think I handled it. I thought, I think she's going to be okay. I thought, the jasmine's going to need cutting back again in 2 weeks, and maybe this time Claire will be here to help. It wasn't a certainty. Nothing in this life comes with a guarantee, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But it was possible, and possibility, at 68, after everything, feels like more than enough. I choose what I pass on. I choose what I stand for. I choose, every single time I'm tested, whether I will let the moment define me or whether I will define the moment. That is not arrogance. That is not stubbornness. That is the only thing a man who has built a life from the ground up has truly earned the right to know his own weight. I closed my eyes. The crickets kept going. The jasmine was out there in the dark, fragrant and patient, waiting for spring, the way things that are rooted always wait, without anxiety, without performance, simply certain of what they are. That is how I have always tried to live. That is what I have always hoped she was watching.